Tonight, we are going back to the very beginning of Japan's story. Not the Japan of samurai and shoguns, not the Japan of castles and cherry blossoms. We are going back to a Japan that existed thousands of years before any of that. A Japan so ancient and so different from anything we know today that it might as well be another world entirely. And it begins with a question that sounds simple but turns out to be surprisingly difficult to answer. When did people first arrive on the islands of Japan, and where did they come from? The best answer we have is that humans first reached the Japanese archipelago somewhere between 30 and 40,000 years ago, possibly even earlier. They came in several waves from different directions by different routes. Some may have crossed from the north through what is now the Tsugaru Strait between Hokkaido and Honshu, when lower sea levels during the ice ages made that crossing easier. Others may have come from the west, across the Korea Strait from the Asian mainland. Others still may have come by boat from the south, island hopping up through the Ryukyu chain. They came to a place unlike anywhere else on Earth. The islands of Japan had been forming for millions of years before the first human foot touched their shores. Pushed up from the ocean floor by volcanic activity along the Pacific Ring of Fire, reshaped by earthquakes and eruptions, and the slow grinding of tectonic plates, the archipelago that emerged was one of the most geologically active landscapes on the planet, and one of the most beautiful. The mountains of Japan rise steeply from the sea. There is almost no flat land. The valleys are narrow, and the rivers run fast and cold from the peaks to the coast. The forests that covered the mountains were ancient and dense, cathedral-like in their silence, full of cedar and cypress and oak and maple, of moss and fern and the calls of birds that existed nowhere else. And the sea. The sea that surrounds these islands is not just water. It is a living system of extraordinary productivity. The cold Oyashio current sweeps down from the north, carrying nutrients from the depths. The warm Kuroshio current moves up from the south, carrying the richness of tropical waters. Where these two currents meet, in the waters around Japan, they create conditions of biological abundance that sustained human populations for thousands of years without any need for farming. The first people who came to these islands found a paradise, and they stayed. We call these first inhabitants the Jomon people. The name was given to them by archaeologists in the 19th century, taken from the Japanese word for the distinctive cord-marked patterns on their pottery. Jomon simply means rope pattern. It is a name about a technique, not a name about a people, and it was assigned from outside after the fact by people trying to make sense of what they found in the ground. The Jomon themselves had no such name for themselves, of course. They had names for their communities, their clans, their families. They had names for the places they lived, and the rivers they fished, and the mountains they regarded with awe and respect. But a collective name for all the people living on all the islands across all the centuries, that kind of abstraction was not part of how they understood themselves. What we know about them we have learned entirely from what they left behind. And what they left behind is remarkable. The pottery is the most abundant evidence. It has been found at sites across the entire archipelago, from the northern tip of Hokkaido to the southern islands of Kyushu, and it is old. Extraordinarily old. Some Jomon pottery has been dated to 15,000 years ago. Some fragments may be even older than that. which makes Jomon pottery among the oldest known pottery in the entire world. This is remarkable because pottery, as we usually understand it, is associated with the agricultural revolution. You make pottery to store grain, to cook plant foods, to manage the surplus that farming produces. The Jomon were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers, people who lived by hunting animals and gathering wild plants and fishing the rivers and the sea. And yet they made pottery, beautiful and technically sophisticated pottery, thousands of years before anyone in Japan planted a single seed. Why? The most practical answer is that pottery expanded what they could eat. A clay pot makes it possible to boil food, and boiling opens up a whole range of plant and animal foods that are difficult or impossible to eat raw. You can make stews from tough roots and fibrous plants. You can render fat from animal bones. You can process the bitter tannins out of acorns, which were one of the most abundant and nutritious foods available in the Japanese forests, by repeatedly boiling them and discarding the water. But some Jomon pottery clearly goes beyond the purely practical. Some vessels are extraordinarily elaborate, covered in complex patterns, formed into dramatic shapes that seem more ceremonial than functional, rims decorated with flame-like projections rising from the edges of cooking pots, surfaces covered in swirling designs that look almost organic, like the patterns of growth in living things. These are not just containers. They are objects made with care and skill and aesthetic intention, objects whose beauty mattered to the people who made them. That impulse to make something that is not merely useful but also beautiful is one of the most distinctively human things there is. The Jomon had it 15,000 years ago on these islands, surrounded by the sea. The Jomon built their homes in shallow pits dug into the earth. Archaeologists call these pit houses, and the name is accurate, if not particularly evocative. The pit itself was usually no more than half a meter deep, just enough to take advantage of the earth's natural insulation. Over the pit, a framework of wooden poles was erected. The poles set into the ground around the perimeter and brought together at the top, lashed with cord or vine. Over this framework, thick bundles of thatch were layered, overlapping like the scales of a fish, creating a surface that would shed rain. Sometimes a layer of earth was piled over the thatch as well, creating a roof that blended almost invisibly into the surrounding landscape. At the center of the pit, a hearth, a shallow depression in the packed earth floor, lined with stones in which a fire burned. That fire was the heart of everything. In a world without electricity, without any source of artificial light except fire, the hearth was the sun of the household universe. Everything oriented itself toward the fire. The family gathered around it in the evenings, arranged in the hierarchy of warmth, the oldest and most honored closest to the heat, the youngest at the edges, falling asleep as the warmth reached them through the cool air of the pit house interior. The fire was never entirely allowed to go out. Tending the fire was as important as any other domestic task. You chose the right wood for it, dry and slow-burning, wood that would hold a bed of coals through the night and be easily revived in the morning. You managed its drafts, its breathing. In a world without matches, without any convenient way to start a fire from scratch, the fire you maintained was the fire you kept. Losing it meant real hardship, the labor of creating a new one by friction, the cold hours before it was established. The fire was, in the deepest sense, the home. The pit house was just the structure built around it. Jomon villages were small. The typical settlement consisted of perhaps 5 to 10 pit houses arranged in a rough circle or oval around a central open space, with a total population of somewhere between 20 and 100 people. This scale was not accidental or arbitrary. It reflected the ecological realities of the landscape. A group too small could not accomplish the tasks that required collective effort. Organizing a deer hunt, building and maintaining the fish weirs that directed salmon into traps during the spring runs, caring for the sick and elderly, defending against the threats, human and animal, that were part of life in the forest. A group too large quickly exhausted the resources of the surrounding territory. The forests and rivers and coastal waters of ancient Japan were rich, but they were not infinite, and they could only support a certain density of human population before the balance between use and renewal was disrupted. A group that exceeded that density would find food becoming scarce, tensions rising, the need to move or split apart becoming urgent. The Jomon found their balance in small groups, and in those small groups they built something remarkable. Not cities, not monuments, not empires. They built communities, webs of relationship and obligation, and shared knowledge so intricate and so durable that they persisted in recognizable form for 14,000 years. That is, when you think about it, an extraordinary achievement. The Roman Empire lasted 500 years. The Egyptian Old Kingdom, one of the most stable political entities in human history, lasted about 400. The Jomon way of life, the specific constellation of practices and beliefs and social arrangements that we recognize as distinctively Jomon, persisted for 14,000 years. No institution, no civilization, no political system in all of recorded history has lasted anything close to that long. The Jomon were not isolated from each other. This is one of the things that surprises people when they first learn about them. We tend to imagine prehistoric people as trapped in their local environments, cut off from the wider world by distance and wilderness, their horizons no wider than the nearest ridge of mountains. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story. Obsidian, a volcanic glass that fractures with a razor-sharp edge, and was the finest cutting material available in the pre-metal world, comes from specific volcanic sources scattered across the Japanese archipelago. The obsidian from the major source on the island of Kozushima, a small island in the Pacific southeast of the Izu Peninsula, has been found at Jomon sites across a wide arc of territory, sites that are separated from the source by hundreds of kilometers of sea and land. People were moving this material, whether by direct travel, by chains of exchange passing the material from community to community, or by some combination of both. The obsidian was moving across large distances through networks of human connection. Shells from the warm Ryukyu Islands in the far south have been found at Jomon sites in the cold northeast. Amber from Hokkaido in the north has been found in western Honshu. Objects that could only have come from specific places appear again and again, far from their origins. The Jomon were connected. They traveled. They traded. They met each other, exchanged things with each other, and very likely married into each other's communities, maintaining the networks of kinship and alliance that held the larger world together. The forests of ancient Japan were not empty wilderness. They were inhabited, traversed, and known. Every path through them was a path someone had walked before, worn smooth by the passage of generations. Every river crossing was a place people had crossed before, in all weathers and all seasons, with children on their backs and bundles of trade goods over their shoulders. This was not the world of isolated primitives struggling to survive. It was the world of a sophisticated, mobile, well-connected people who understood their landscape with an intimacy that is almost impossible for us to imagine today, and who maintained relationships across that landscape that served the practical, social, and spiritual needs of their communities for thousands of years. The seasons governed everything. To understand Jomon life, you have to understand that the year was not an abstract cycle of months on a calendar. It was a sequence of events, each one with its specific demands and its specific rewards, each one known in intimate detail from a lifetime of experience and centuries of accumulated knowledge passed from generation to generation. Spring announced itself in the Japanese forests with the running of the salmon. The rivers would fill with fish returning from the sea to spawn. Enormous runs of animals packed so densely into the channels that people said you could walk across their backs, though this was almost certainly an exaggeration. The Jomon were ready for them. Weirs constructed from woven branches and driven stakes directed the fish into traps. Nets of twisted plant fiber stretched across the narrower channels. The catch was enormous, far more than could be consumed fresh, and the surplus was dried and smoked and stored, packed into clay jars or wrapped in bark against the leaner months ahead. Summer was the season of abundance and expansion. The forests were full of green things to gather, young shoots and leaves and roots whose nutritional value the Jomon knew in specific detail. The sea was calmer, allowing longer fishing expeditions out to the richer waters offshore. The shellfish on the rocky shores were fat and numerous. The children of the village could range further from the houses in the long evenings, playing in the forest and the shallows, learning through play the landscape skills they would need as adults. The enormous shell middens that Jomon settlements accumulated over the centuries, some of them meters thick and covering areas of many hectares, are the remains of thousands of years of shellfish consumption. They are also some of the richest sources of information we have about Jomon life. The bones of fish and animals buried in the middens tell us what the Jomon were eating across the seasons. The objects discarded among the shells, broken pottery, worn tools, occasional human burials, tell us about their technology and their social practices. Autumn was the time of greatest plenty on land. Chestnuts fell from the trees in their thousands, rich in carbohydrates and fat, easy to gather and easy to store. Walnuts and acorns and hazelnuts and dozens of other nut varieties contributed to a harvest of extraordinary richness. The deer and wild boar were at their fattest after a summer of good eating, and the autumn hunts combined necessity with what we might reasonably imagine was genuine excitement, the coordinated pursuit of large animals through the colored forest, the dogs running ahead, the hunters with their bows and their spears fanning out through the undergrowth. And then winter. The long, cold, dark winter of northern Japan, when the rivers froze and the forest went quiet, and the village turned inward around its fire. The stores laid in during the other seasons were drawn down carefully, calculated to last until spring. The enforced intimacy of the winter village, Everyone crowded together in the pit houses, the children underfoot and the elders close, was also the season of story, of the long evenings when the accumulated knowledge of the community was transmitted to the next generation in the form of narrative. What stories did they tell? We will never know. The languages in which they were told left no written trace, and the stories themselves vanished when the people who carried them were gone. But we know they had stories, because all human communities have stories, and because the complexity and persistence of Jomon culture over 14,000 years would have been impossible without robust systems of knowledge transmission. They told stories around their fires in the long winter nights. The stories carried everything that mattered. The knowledge of which plants were poisonous and which were medicinal. The locations of the best fishing spots and the signs that told you when the fish would run. The names and natures of the powers that inhabited the landscape. The obligations owed to the dead and the expectations of the living, the history of the community going back as far as memory could reach. In those stories, everything the Jomon knew was held, and in the voices of the people who told them, generation after generation, it was kept alive. The tools that the Jomon made tell us a great deal about their lives and their capabilities. Stone tools were fundamental. The Jomon were skilled knappers, people who could take a raw piece of flint or obsidian and, through a precise sequence of controlled strikes, produce a tool with a sharp working edge. The technique required knowledge, practice, and a kind of spatial intelligence, the ability to see in 3 dimensions the tool that was hidden inside the stone, and to remove the material that was not the tool in the right sequence and with the right force. Different stones produced different tools suited to different purposes. Obsidian, the volcanic glass that fractures with an extraordinarily sharp edge, was prized for cutting tools, blades and scrapers, and arrowheads that needed to be as sharp as possible. Harder, tougher stones were used for tools that needed to withstand impact rather than provide a cutting edge. Hammer stones for cracking nuts, grinding stones for processing plant foods, heavy chopping tools for splitting wood. The distribution of stone tools across Jomon sites tells us something important about the networks of exchange that connected these communities. Obsidian from specific volcanic sources, identifiable by its chemical signature, has been found at Jomon sites hundreds of kilometers from the nearest possible source. The stone was moving through the landscape, passed from community to community, traded for other things of value, carried by travelers on journeys that took them far from their home territories. These were not isolated communities. They were nodes in networks that spanned much of the archipelago. Information moved along those networks as well as goods. Ideas about how to make pottery, how to organize a hunt, how to read the weather or the sea. The Jomon world was not a collection of separate, independent villages. It was a connected system in which knowledge and material and people all moved through channels maintained by generations of relationship and reciprocity. Beyond stone, the Jomon worked with bone and antler to make tools of great refinement. Fish hooks carved from bone, small and precise, suited to the specific species they were after. Needles of remarkable fineness, thin enough to work the kind of detailed stitching that well-made clothing requires. Harpoon points with barbs that would hold in a large fish or a sea mammal once they had penetrated. The quality of these bone tools is a reminder that the Jomon were not improvising their material culture from scratch each generation. They were working within traditions of craft knowledge that had been developed and refined over centuries, that had been tested against the specific demands of the specific environment they lived in, and that represented accumulated solutions to problems that their ancestors had solved before them. A bone needle that is exactly the right size and shape for sewing the specific kind of clothing needed in the specific climate of a specific part of Japan is not a product of individual ingenuity. It is a product of generations of craft knowledge, tested and refined and transmitted with care. The person who made it was not inventing, they were inheriting and adding their own small contribution to a tradition that stretched back before living memory. This is one of the things that makes the Jomon so interesting as a subject of study. Their material culture represents not the achievements of individuals, but the accumulated achievements of a tradition, the slow accretion of better solutions to persistent problems over enormous spans of time. 14,000 years of people asking the same questions and building on each other's answers. The result was a way of life of extraordinary efficiency and sophistication, tuned to its specific environment with a precision that no individual could have achieved and that no short-lived civilization could have developed. The physical appearance of the Jomon people can be partially reconstructed from skeletal remains, and in recent years, genetic analysis has added significant detail to this reconstruction. The Jomon were, on average, shorter than modern Japanese people. Their facial structure was more robust, with stronger brow ridges and more pronounced cheekbones than the faces of the Yayoi farmers who would eventually mix with them. Their teeth show the wear patterns of a diet that included significant amounts of tough, fibrous plant foods, the kind of diet that requires real chewing and that produces characteristic patterns of dental wear. Their DNA, recovered from ancient skeletal remains and compared with both modern Japanese people and with populations elsewhere in Asia, tells a complex story. The Jomon were not closely related to any currently existing population. They represent a lineage that diverged from the common ancestors of East Asian populations very early, perhaps 40,000 or more years ago, and then developed in relative isolation on the Japanese islands for tens of thousands of years before the arrival of the Yayoi. The Jomon contribution to the modern Japanese genetic pool is real and significant, though it is variable across different regions of the country and different segments of the population. People from Okinawa in the far south and from Tohoku in the northeast tend to have somewhat higher proportions of Jomon ancestry than people from the central regions of the country, reflecting the different histories of contact and mixing between Jomon and Yayoi populations in different areas. The Ainu people of Hokkaido have the highest proportions of Jomon ancestry of any group in Japan today, a reflection of the fact that Hokkaido remained largely outside the Yayoi agricultural expansion and maintained a way of life with strong connections to the Jomon tradition until relatively recent times. But even in the most Yayoi-influenced regions of Japan, the Jomon presence in the genome is detectable. The people of Japan today carry within them the genetic legacy of 14,000 years of life on these islands. The Jomon are not gone. They are present, dispersed in the cells of their descendants. This is not a trivial point. It means that the Jomon are not simply a subject of historical curiosity, not simply an interesting chapter in the story of how Japan came to be. They are ancestors. They are the people from whom the Japanese are, in part, descended. Their resilience, their patience, their extraordinary attunement to their environment, their capacity to sustain a complex and beautiful culture over an almost incomprehensible span of time. These are not qualities that belong only to the past. They are part of the inheritance. When we try to understand the Jomon, we are trying to understand something about where the Japanese people came from, in the most literal sense. And perhaps, in understanding that, something about who they are. The spiritual world of the Jomon was as rich and complex as their material world, and in some ways inseparable from it. They did not draw the sharp distinction between the natural and the supernatural that modern Western thinking tends to assume as a default. For the Jomon, the world was simply full of power, power that manifested in different ways in different places and things, power that had to be acknowledged and respected and, when possible, cultivated. The mountains were not simply geological features. They were inhabited by presences of enormous authority, beings whose attention could be helpful or harmful depending on how you approach them. A hunter entering the mountain to pursue deer was not simply entering a forest. He was entering the domain of something that had its own rules and its own expectations. You announced yourself, you showed respect, you took what you needed and no more, and you acknowledged the gift with the appropriate gestures and words. The rivers had similar presences. The salmon that ran in them every spring were not simply fish. They were visitors from another realm, guests of the river. And they came because the relationship between the people and the river's power was in good order. If that relationship deteriorated, if the proper acknowledgments were neglected or the proper limits exceeded, the salmon might not come. The relationship required maintenance. The sea was the most powerful and the most unpredictable of all. The ocean around Japan could be calm and generous, offering its fish and its shellfish to those who knew how to ask. It could also be sudden and violent, producing storms and tsunamis that could destroy a coastal community in hours. The sea had to be approached with a specific kind of respect, a respect that acknowledged both its generosity and its indifference to human welfare. And the forest, the great dark forest that pressed against the village on every side, was perhaps the most complex spiritual environment of all. It was full of spirits, beings of every kind and every degree of power, from the small presences that inhabited individual rocks and trees to the great ones that owned entire valleys and mountain ranges. Navigating the forest was not just a matter of knowing the paths. It was a matter of knowing the protocol, the etiquette of encounter with the invisible inhabitants of the wild. This way of understanding the world, which anthropologists call animism, is not a primitive or confused version of more sophisticated religious thought. It is a complete and coherent system for understanding and relating to a world in which human beings are not the dominant force, in which the powers that actually control the conditions of life are non-human and only partially knowable, and in which the appropriate human response to that situation is careful attention, respectful relationship, and ongoing negotiation rather than domination or exploitation. It is, in many ways, a more ecologically sophisticated worldview than the one that replaced it. The Jomon understood that they lived within a system that did not exist for their benefit, and that their continued flourishing depended on maintaining the health of that system. Whether they understood this in terms of spirits and obligations or in terms of resource management is ultimately a question of language rather than substance. What they did, practically, was take care of the world they lived in. And it worked for 14,000 years. The dog are the most intimate window we have into the inner life of the Jomon. These small clay figures, ranging in size from a few centimeters to about 30, have been found at Jomon sites across the archipelago in their thousands. They span the entire Jomon period, from early simple forms to the elaborate masterpieces of the later periods, and they vary enormously in style and subject. The earliest dog are simple and almost abstract, human forms barely differentiated from the clay around them, made quickly and with little elaboration. They might have been produced by anyone with basic pottery skills, perhaps in the context of a specific ritual need, the equivalent of a quick prayer or a simple offering. The later dog are something else entirely. By the middle and late Jomon periods, from roughly 5,000 to 2,000 years ago, dog had become extraordinarily sophisticated objects, made by skilled craftspeople with considerable investment of time and technical ability. The most famous type is what archaeologists call the goggle-eyed dog. Figures whose most striking feature is a pair of enormous round eyes that seem to wrap around the head, giving the face an expression of perpetual wide-eyed attention. The body of these figures is typically covered in intricate patterns pressed into the clay before firing, spiraling designs and geometric shapes that seem to carry meaning, but whose specific significance we cannot recover. These figures are haunting in a way that is difficult to explain and that does not diminish with familiarity. Standing before a goggle-eyed dog in a museum, knowing nothing about its cultural context, you feel something. A presence. A gaze turned outward from across 5,000 years. Many dog have prominent female features, rounded hips and swollen bellies, sometimes explicit breasts, sometimes a represented pregnancy. These are almost universally interpreted as fertility figures, connected to the concerns of reproduction and childbirth that were central to the survival of any small community. In a world without modern medicine, pregnancy and childbirth were genuinely dangerous. Infant mortality was high. The fear of losing a mother or a child was not an occasional tragedy, but a constant background presence. The dog may have served as focuses for prayers and rituals connected to these fears. Perhaps a woman about to give birth held one, or had one placed near her. Perhaps the ritual involved the figure absorbing the risk, taking onto itself the danger that threatened the woman, and then being broken to release what it had absorbed. Because many dog have been found broken, not accidentally broken, not the kind of damage that happens when a clay object falls on a hard floor, deliberately broken, an arm removed cleanly, a leg, sometimes the head. The breaks are too precise, too consistent to be anything other than intentional. The breaking of ritual objects to release their power, to complete a ceremony, to send an intention into the invisible world, is a practice found in many cultures across many periods of human history. It is not primitive or strange. It is a specific technology of the sacred, a way of doing something that words alone cannot accomplish. We made the thing with care. We charged it with intention. We used it for its purpose, and then we broke it, deliberately and precisely, to let it go. There is something in this practice that resonates across all the centuries between us and the Jomon. The understanding that some things need to be made in order to be destroyed. That completion sometimes looks like ending. That the act of letting go can itself be a form of creation. The Jomon relationship with their dead was one of the most distinctive aspects of their culture, and one of the most revealing. In many cultures, the dead are separated from the living. They are taken to special places, cemeteries or burial grounds, at a distance from the settlement. Places where the living visit to pay their respects, but do not otherwise spend time. The logic of this separation is often about purity and pollution, the idea that death is a kind of contamination that needs to be contained and managed. The Jomon did something different. They buried their dead within the village, sometimes in the floors of the houses themselves, sometimes in the central open spaces between the houses, the communal areas where daily life was conducted. The dead were not sent away. They were kept close. They remained, in some sense, part of the community. What this meant in terms of belief is not entirely clear. We cannot know exactly what the Jomon thought happened after death, or what they understood the relationship between the living and the dead to be. But the practice of keeping the dead within the village suggests at minimum that the dead were not understood as dangerous, not as sources of pollution or threat that needed to be removed from proximity to the living. They were understood as presences that could coexist with the living, perhaps as protectors of the household, perhaps as ancestors whose power and wisdom remained available to those who had the knowledge to access them. Some Jomon burials include red ochre sprinkled over the bones. Red ochre is iron oxide, a mineral pigment that produces a deep, warm red color, the color of blood, the color of vitality. The practice of using red ochre in burial is so widespread across so many cultures and so many periods of prehistory that it seems to represent something almost universal in human responses to death. The gesture says something about hope, about the refusal to entirely accept that the person before you is simply gone, about the desire to sustain something of life in the face of its absence. Some burials include grave goods, tools that the person used in life, shell ornaments, pieces of pottery. The logic of grave goods implies a belief in some kind of continuation after death, some existence beyond this one for which the dead person would need or want the things that mattered to them in life. You do not put a knife in a grave for a person who has ceased to exist. You put it there because you believe or hope that they are going somewhere where a knife might be useful. These are, when you sit with them, deeply moving practices. Not because they are exotic or strange, but because they are recognizable. The desire to honor the dead, the wish that something of them might continue, the refusal to simply dispose of the people who mattered to us. These are not Jomon feelings, they are human feelings. And across 10,000 years and all the enormous differences of culture and context, they connect us to these people in a way that is immediate and real. Around 12,000 years ago, the climate of the world began to warm. The great ice sheets that had covered much of the northern hemisphere for tens of thousands of years slowly retreated. Sea levels rose as the ice melted. The land bridges that had connected the Japanese islands to the Asian continent during the coldest periods of the Ice Age gradually disappeared beneath the rising waters. Japan became an island nation in the fullest sense, separated from the mainland by stretches of open water that were navigable by skilled sailors, but not casually crossable on foot. The isolation was not complete. The sea was a barrier, but not an impermeable one, and contact with the continent continued throughout the Jomon period. But it was real, and it shaped the character of Jomon civilization in important ways. Isolation, or semi-isolation, tends to produce cultural distinctiveness. When a population is not constantly being refreshed by migration and cultural contact, it develops in its own directions, accumulates its own specific knowledge and practices, becomes in some ways more itself. The Jomon had 14,000 years to become themselves, and the result was a culture of remarkable coherence and sophistication. The warming of the climate after the Ice Age also transformed the landscape that the Jomon inhabited. The forests of Japan changed as temperatures rose, the cold adapted species retreating northward and to higher elevations, replaced by the warm temperate forests of oak and chestnut and other broadleaf trees that are still characteristic of much of Japan today. These forests were, if anything, even more productive than the ones they replaced, and the Jomon adapted to them and thrived in them. The sea also changed. As the ice melted and sea levels rose, the coastlines of Japan shifted, in some places dramatically. Shallow coastal areas that had been dry land became shallow seas, and shallow seas became productive fishing grounds. The Jomon followed the coast, establishing their shell middens at the edges of the new shorelines, adapting their fishing and gathering practices to the changing conditions. The capacity to adapt, to read the changes in the landscape and respond to them without being overwhelmed by them, is one of the most striking characteristics of the Jomon record. 14,000 years is a long time, and the world changed significantly during it, in temperature, in sea level, in the composition of the forests and the abundance of different food sources. The Jomon navigated all of these changes and continued recognizably themselves throughout. The late Jomon period, from roughly 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, shows some signs of stress. Populations that had been growing through the warmer, more productive Middle Jomon period began to decline in some regions. Shell middens, which had been growing larger and more elaborate for thousands of years, began to be used less intensively. The number of sites in some areas decreased. The elaborateness of material culture, which had reached extraordinary heights in the Middle Jomon, with its spectacular goggle-eyed dog and its flame-rimmed pottery, became somewhat simpler. The reasons for this are debated among archaeologists. Climate change may have played a role. The warm period that had made the Middle Jomon so productive began to cool slightly in the late Jomon, reducing the productivity of some food sources. Disease may have been a factor. Population pressure on local resources in some areas may have led to conflict and displacement, or the changes may simply reflect the natural dynamics of hunter-gatherer populations in a variable environment. the kind of fluctuations in numbers and distribution that happen in any biological system over long periods of time. What is clear is that the late Jomon was not the vigorous, expanding culture that the middle Jomon had been. Something had shifted. The balance that had held for so long was under new pressures. And from across the sea, something new was coming. The people who would bring rice to Japan were already farming on the Korean peninsula. The technology of wet rice agriculture had been spreading eastward from its origins in China for centuries. The peninsula had been transformed by it, and the narrow strip of water that separated the peninsula from the Japanese island of Kyushu, less than 200 kilometers at its narrowest point, was not an obstacle to people who had been sailing the seas of East Asia for generations. The encounter between the Jomon and these newcomers would change Japan forever, but it would not happen quickly, and it would not happen simply, and the Jomon world would not simply vanish when it began. It would persist, it would adapt, it would transform itself slowly over centuries, and something of it, something essential and irreducible, would survive in the culture and the character and perhaps the very bodies of the people who came after. Something of it survives still. To understand what was lost and what survived when the Jomon world gave way to the Yayoi, it helps to think carefully about what the Jomon had actually achieved in those 14,000 years. It was not technological achievement in the sense that we usually mean. The Jomon did not build cities, they did not develop writing, they did not produce the kind of monumental architecture that tends to impress later generations. By the standards that industrial civilization uses to measure progress, the Jomon at the end of their period were not dramatically more advanced than the Jomon at the beginning. But this framing misses the point. The Jomon were not trying to build cities or develop writing. They were trying to live well in a specific landscape, to sustain their communities across generations, to maintain the relationships with each other and with the natural world that made that life possible. And by those standards, they were extraordinarily successful. 14,000 years is a duration that makes all of recorded history look brief. The Jomon sustained their way of life for longer than recorded history has existed. They did this without exhausting their resource base, without triggering the kind of ecological collapse that has ended many later civilizations. This was not luck, it was management. The Jomon managed their relationship with their environment with a sophistication that is only now beginning to be fully appreciated by researchers. They understood the limits of what the landscape could provide, and they organized their lives accordingly. What made this possible was knowledge, specifically the kind of deep, detailed, place-specific knowledge of the natural world that can only be accumulated over very long periods of time and transmitted through very robust cultural practices. The Jomon knew their landscape with an intimacy that is almost impossible for people in modern societies to imagine. They knew the patterns of every river in their territory, where the fish gathered in which seasons, which channels flooded in spring, and which remained navigable through the winter. They knew the phenology of every plant species in their range, when each one leafed out in spring, when it flowered, when its fruits ripened, how to process it to make it edible, how to store it to preserve its nutritional value. They knew the behavior of every animal species they encountered. the signs that indicated where deer had been feeding, how to read the weather from the behavior of birds and the look of the sky, which winds brought fish close to shore and which drove them away. This knowledge was not written down. It could not be written down. It lived in the people themselves, in the accumulated experience of a lifetime of careful observation, combined with the transmitted experience of generations of predecessors. It was held in the stories that the elders told, in the skills that the experience taught the young, in the habits of attention that were instilled from childhood and refined across a lifetime. When the Jomon world ended, this knowledge mostly ended with it. The specific, place-specific, empirically accumulated knowledge of 14,000 years of careful attention to a specific landscape was not preserved in any form that later generations could access. It simply ceased to exist as the people who carried it were displaced or absorbed or transformed into something different. This is one of the great losses of the transition from the Jomon to the Yayoi world. Not the loss of pottery styles or ritual practices or any specific cultural artifact, but the loss of that irreplaceable body of knowledge, that 14,000-year accumulation of attention to the natural world. Some of it survived in fragments, in the practices and beliefs of the communities that retain the most Jomon ancestry. Some of it is preserved indirectly in the material record of what the Jomon did and how they lived. But most of it is gone. And its absence is a kind of wound in our understanding of what the Japanese islands once were, and what the human relationship with the natural world can look like when it has had 14,000 years to mature. The dog, those haunting clay figures that the Jomon produced across the later centuries of their period, deserve more attention than we have given them so far. They are, in a very real sense, the most human objects that the Jomon left behind. The pottery is technically impressive and aesthetically remarkable, but it is primarily a record of a craft tradition. The shell middens are a record of eating habits and settlement patterns. Even the burials, moving as they are, tell us more about practices than about inner lives. The dog are different. They are objects of intention, made not to contain food or to bury the dead, but to do something in the world that we can only partially understand. They are records of belief, of fear, of hope, of the specific ways that the Jomon people understood their relationship to the forces that govern their lives. The variety of dog forms across the Jomon period is striking. In the early and middle periods, the figures tend to be relatively simple, flat, and schematic, human forms suggested rather than elaborated. But as the Jomon period progresses, and particularly in the later centuries, the dog become more complex, more three-dimensional, more individually distinctive. The goggle-eyed dog, with their enormous circular eyes and their bodies covered in intricate patterns, represent the peak of this development. They are objects of considerable technical accomplishment. Making them required skill in three-dimensional modeling, knowledge of how clay behaves when fired, and the ability to apply complex surface decoration with consistency and precision. But they are not primarily technical achievements. They are expressions of something. The question is what? The goggle eyes are the most immediately striking feature, and they have attracted the most interpretive attention. Various explanations have been proposed. They may represent snow goggles, the kind of eye protection used by Arctic peoples to prevent snow blindness, suggesting a connection to ritual practices associated with winter. They may be conventional representations of eyes that had acquired a specific symbolic meaning within the Jomon tradition, a meaning that we cannot recover from the objects alone. What is clear is that the eyes are doing something. They are not simply large for aesthetic reasons. They carry meaning. They are an intentional choice, made and repeated across many examples over many generations, which means that whatever they meant was understood and valued within the tradition that produced them. The patterns that cover the bodies of the more elaborate dog are similarly intentional and similarly difficult to decode. They are not random. They are organized, consistent, following conventions that were clearly shared across the communities that produced them. They look to modernize like tattoos, and this comparison may not be entirely misleading. If the patterns on the dog represent the patterns that Jomon people wore on their own bodies, then the dog are not just ritual objects, but also records of a practice of body decoration that left no other trace in the archaeological record. The deliberately broken dog remain among the most thought-provoking objects in the entire Jomon record. The precision of the breaks, the consistency with which specific parts of the body were removed, the fact that the broken pieces are often found separately rather than together. All of this points to a ritual practice that was widely shared and carefully followed. One interpretation that has gained traction among some researchers is that the dog were used in healing rituals. The figure absorbs the illness or the injury of a specific person, taking it into itself, and is then broken to destroy what it has absorbed. The broken arm of the dog corresponds to the injured arm of the patient. The breaking of the figure is the cure. This interpretation is speculative. We cannot verify it from the objects alone. But it is not implausible. Similar practices are documented in many other cultures, across many periods of human history. The use of a material object as a vehicle for spiritual intervention, a thing that can absorb harm and then be destroyed to eliminate it, is a widespread human practice. If this is what the Jomon were doing with their dog, then they were engaging in a form of medicine that was also a form of art and a form of prayer, all simultaneously. They were making beautiful objects in order to heal people. And when the healing was complete, they broke what they had made. There is something in that which resonates across all the centuries between us and them. The making and the breaking, the creation and the release, the understanding that some things need to be unmade in order for other things to be whole. These are not primitive ideas. They are sophisticated responses to the fundamental conditions of human life. And they were being worked out in clay on these islands 15,000 years ago. The people who brought rice to Japan arrived gradually, over centuries, from the Korean peninsula and ultimately from regions of the Asian mainland, where wet rice agriculture had been practiced for a very long time. We call them the yayoi, another name given by archaeologists after the fact, taken from the district in Tokyo where their distinctive pottery style was first identified in the 19th century. Like the Jomon before them, the Yayoi had no such collective name for themselves. They were simply people, farmers and fishermen and craftspeople and traders coming to a new land for reasons we can only guess at. Population pressure on the peninsula, climate fluctuations that made the familiar lands less productive, the simple human impulse to move, to explore, to find out what lay beyond the horizon. They came to northern Kyushu first. The western tip of that island is only a few hours by boat from the Korean coast on a clear day with a favorable wind. The crossing was not easy, but it was manageable, and people had been making it in both directions for a long time before the Yayoi rice farmers arrived. The landscape they found in northern Kyushu was, in some ways, familiar. The forested mountains, the rivers running to the sea, the productive coastal waters. But it was different too, warmer and wetter than the peninsula they had left, with a growing season that was, in important ways, more favorable for the kind of rice cultivation they knew. They began to clear land. They began to build the flooded paddy fields that rice requires. And they began, slowly and in small numbers at first, to establish themselves in the westernmost part of the Japanese islands. The logic of wet rice agriculture is worth understanding in some detail, because it shapes everything that follows. Rice is a grass, originally domesticated somewhere in the Yangtze River Valley of what is now China, probably around 9,000 or 10,000 years ago. It was cultivated in wet conditions, in flooded fields, because wet cultivation suppresses weeds, maintains soil fertility, and produces much higher yields than dry cultivation of the same plant. To grow rice in flooded paddies, you need several things. You need flat or nearly flat land that can hold water. You need a reliable water supply, either from rainfall or from irrigation. You need the capacity to control water, to flood the fields at the right time and drain them at the right time. And you need the organizational capacity to coordinate all of this, because the water management systems required for rice cultivation are rarely things that a single family or even a single village can build and maintain alone. The last point is crucial. Rice agriculture creates a need for collective organization that goes beyond anything hunter-gatherer societies normally require. Someone has to decide how the water will be shared among the different farmers drawing from the same source. Someone has to organize the labor of building and repairing the irrigation infrastructure. Someone has to mediate when two farmers' needs conflict. That someone, whoever they are, holds power. And in a society where rice is the foundation of survival, power over water is power over everything. The Yayoi brought not just rice, but an entire social technology, a set of practices and institutions for organizing collective life around agricultural production. And that technology would prove, over the centuries of the Yayoi period, to be enormously consequential for the development of Japanese civilization. The Jomon people who were already living in Kyushu when the Yayoi arrived did not simply disappear. The encounter between the two populations was complex, varied, and played out differently in different places and different times. In some areas, there is clear evidence of conflict. Human skeletons from Yayoi period sites in northern Kyushu bear the marks of violence, arrowheads embedded in bone, evidence of wounds that were not survived. In one famous site, a cemetery of late Jomon and early Yayoi burials, the skeletal remains show a population that was experiencing significant stress. with evidence of nutritional deficiency and disease as well as violence. The arrival of the Yayoi was not, for the Jomon, a benign or welcome event in all places. The newcomers wanted land, the flat land near rivers that was best suited to rice cultivation. The Jomon had been using that land for thousands of years for hunting and gathering and fishing. The competition for the most productive landscapes was real, and it sometimes turned violent. In other areas, the evidence suggests a more gradual and less conflicted process of integration. Jomon pottery styles and Yayoi pottery styles appear together at some sites, suggesting that the two populations were living in proximity and exchanging cultural elements. The genetic evidence confirms that the two populations were intermarrying from early in the period of contact. Children of mixed Jomon and Yayoi parentage were being born and growing up in communities that were neither purely one thing nor purely the other. The modern Japanese population carries the genetic legacy of this encounter. Studies of ancient DNA from Jomon and Yayoi period remains, compared with the DNA of modern Japanese people, have shown clearly that both lineages are present in the contemporary population, with the Yayoi contribution generally dominant, but the Jomon contribution real and significant and variable across different regions of the country. The Japanese people are, in a very literal sense, the children of the meeting between the Jomon and the Yayoi. Both lineages run in their blood. Both traditions, however transformed, echo in their culture. The spread of rice agriculture through the Japanese islands was not a rapid or uniform process. It took centuries, and it proceeded differently in different parts of the country, shaped by geography, by the character of the local Jomon populations, and by the specific conditions of soil and climate and water availability that determined where rice could be successfully grown. Northern Kyushu was the beachhead. The Yayoi established their first substantial settlements here, built their first paddy fields, developed the specific techniques for wet rice cultivation in the Japanese climate and soil. Over the first few centuries, the population in this region grew, supported by the reliable food production that rice agriculture made possible. From Kyushu, the Yayoi expansion moved eastward along the shores of the inland sea, the sheltered body of water between the islands of Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. The coastal plains around the inland sea, with their flat terrain and reliable rainfall and numerous rivers providing irrigation water, were ideal for rice cultivation, and the Yayoi settled them extensively. The Kinai region, the area around what is now the cities of Osaka and Nara and Kyoto, became one of the most important centers of Yayoi culture. The wide, flat Yamato Plain, watered by several rivers and protected by mountains on three sides, was among the most productive rice-growing areas in all of ancient Japan. The political importance of this region in later Japanese history was not accidental. It was rooted in the extraordinary agricultural productivity that its geography made possible. The expansion of Yayoi agriculture was slower in the mountainous interior of Honshu and in the far northeast, where the cold climate made rice cultivation more difficult or impossible. The Jomon tradition persisted longer in these areas, and the Jomon presence in the genetics and culture of the people of northern Honshu and Hokkaido is correspondingly stronger. In the far north, in Hokkaido, something remarkable happened. The Yayoi expansion did not reach Hokkaido in any significant way. The island remained Jomon territory throughout the Yayoi period and for a long time afterward. The people who lived there continued the hunting and fishing traditions of the Jomon, adapted to the cold northern environment, and eventually developed into the Ainu culture, the indigenous people of Hokkaido who are still recognized as a distinct ethnic and cultural group in modern Japan. The Ainu are, in a very real sense, the most direct descendants of the Jomon people. Their language, their traditional practices, their genetic profile, all connect them to the pra-Yayoi inhabitants of Japan in ways that the majority of the Japanese population no longer shares as directly. They are a living thread connecting the present to the world of the Jomon 15,000 years ago. The Yayoi period lasted roughly from 300 BCE to 300 CE, give or take a century or two at either end, depending on the region and the criteria used to define the period. 6 centuries of transformation, and the transformation was profound. The landscape of Japan in 300 BCE still looked much as it had during the Jomon period. Forested mountains and narrow coastal plains, with small human settlements scattered at intervals through a largely wild landscape. By 300 CE, the most productive agricultural regions had been substantially cleared and settled. The population had grown significantly, perhaps several times over, sustained by the reliable food production of rice agriculture. Villages had grown larger and more complex. The social hierarchies that rice agriculture tended to produce had become more pronounced and more institutionalized. And the technologies of the period had changed. The Yayoi brought bronze and the knowledge of how to work it from the continent. Bronze was used for weapons and tools, but also, and perhaps more importantly, for ceremonial objects. The dotaku, those extraordinary bronze bells that we will encounter throughout the Yayoi period, represent one of the most remarkable artistic traditions of ancient Japan. Iron arrived somewhat later in the Yayoi period, again from the continent. Iron tools were harder and more durable than bronze, and their adoption transformed agriculture, making it easier to clear forest and to work soil. The spread of iron tools through the Yayoi period was part of the reason agricultural productivity kept increasing. Weaving was another technology that the Yayoi brought. The Jomon had made clothing from animal skins and plant fibers, but woven cloth of the type that became common in the Yayoi period was a new technology in Japan. The loom required to produce it was a continental import, and woven cloth, which could be produced in surplus and traded, became one of the important commodities in the networks of exchange that were developing across the Yayoi world. The dotaku deserve special attention because they are among the most beautiful and most mysterious objects produced in ancient Japan. These large bronze bells, the largest of them nearly a meter tall, were cast using clay molds in a technique imported from the continent. The molds were made in 2 halves, fitted together, with the bronze poured in molten. When the metal cooled and the mold was broken away, the result was an object of extraordinary technical accomplishment, thin-walled for its size, remarkably uniform, and covered in intricate decorative designs. The designs on dotaku are among the finest examples of Yayoi art. Geometric patterns of great complexity, worked out with a precision that must have required skilled craftspeople and careful preparation. And among the geometric patterns, images, small stylized images of animals and people and scenes of daily life, rendered in a few confident lines but immediately legible. There are deer, drawn with an economy of means that somehow captures their essential quality, their lightness and their watchfulness. There are wild boar, there are birds in flight, there are fish, there are images that seem to show people hunting or farming or engaged in ceremonies of some kind. These images are our only visual record of Yayoi daily life, and they are precious beyond measure. They show us a world that the archaeological record alone cannot fully illuminate, a world of people engaged with animals and with each other, a world that was recognizably human. But the Dotaku were not simply decorative objects. They were ritual objects of considerable power, and they were buried. The burial of Dotaku is one of the great mysteries of the Yayoi period. Hundreds have been found across Japan, and the vast majority of them were found not in settlements or graves, but in isolated locations, often on hillsides or mountain slopes, buried deliberately and with evident care. In some cases, multiple Dotaku were buried together in groups, suggesting a coordinated ritual act rather than individual choices made at different times. In other cases, a single Dotaku was buried alone, in a location that seems to have been chosen specifically, though we cannot always understand the criteria of that choice. The simplest explanation is that the Dotaku were offerings, given back to the earth or to the powers that the earth embodied, in return for the agricultural abundance that the earth provided. Rice farming is, fundamentally, an act of taking from the earth, year after year, and the ritual return of valuable objects may have been understood as the appropriate reciprocation for what was taken. But this explanation, while plausible, feels incomplete. The Dotaku that were buried were not worn-out objects nearing the end of their useful life. They were often beautiful, carefully made, sometimes apparently new. Burying them was not disposal. It was sacrifice in the literal sense, the deliberate surrender of something valuable. Whatever the full meaning of the Dotaku burials, they tell us something important about the Yayoi world. They tell us that the people of this period had a complex relationship with the material objects they produced, a relationship in which the objects could carry spiritual significance and in which the appropriate way to handle that significance was sometimes to return the objects to the earth. That relationship between people and objects, between the things we make and the meanings we load onto them, is one of the most distinctively human things there is. And the Yayoi had it in full measure, 15 centuries before the samurai, in a Japan that was still finding its shape. The daily life of an ordinary Yayoi farming family was organized around the rhythm of the rice cycle in ways that touched every aspect of existence. In early spring, before the planting began, there were preparations to make. The paddy fields had to be inspected after the winter, the earthen walls that held the water repaired where they had eroded or collapsed, the irrigation channels cleared of the debris that had accumulated during the cold months. This was communal work, the kind of task that required the cooperation of many households, and that was organized by whoever held authority in the community. The planting itself was one of the most labor-intensive moments of the agricultural year. Rice seedlings were first grown in small nursery beds, planted densely, allowed to develop for several weeks until they were sturdy enough to be transplanted. Then came the transplanting, which required teams of workers moving through flooded fields, bending to plant each seedling individually at the correct spacing, working from one end of the field to the other in a rhythm that was both physically demanding and, in its way, meditative. The transplanting was almost certainly accompanied by ritual, the act of placing a living plant into the flooded earth, of entrusting it to the water and the soil and the uncertain mercy of the weather, was not simply an agricultural act. It was a prayer made physical, a negotiation with the forces that would determine whether the grain grew or failed. Songs were sung during the transplanting and rice farming cultures across Asia, songs that were simultaneously work music, helping the workers maintain their rhythm, and sacred music, addressed to the powers that govern the harvest. Whether the Yayoi sang while they planted, we cannot know, but it would be surprising if they did not. Through the long summer months, the rice grew, and the farmers watched it, watching the water level, maintaining it within the narrow range that the plants required, watching the weather, alert for the storms that could flatten a field of nearly ripe grain, watching for the insects and birds that would eat the crop if not deterred. This watching was not passive, it was active, attentive, the application of generations of accumulated knowledge to the specific conditions of a specific year. And then, in autumn, the harvest. The cutting of the grain was done with small stone or bronze sickles, the stalks gathered into bundles and carried to the threshing area, where the grain was separated from the stalk and collected. The harvested grain was then dried and stored in the raised storehouses that are one of the most characteristic features of Yayoi settlements. These storehouses were important enough to be reproduced in miniature among the Haniwa figures of the later Kofun period, suggesting that they carried a symbolic weight beyond their purely practical function. The storehouse full of rice was the visual embodiment of security, of the community's ability to survive the winter and the lean months before the next harvest. An empty storehouse was a source of existential anxiety. A full one was cause for celebration and gratitude. The Autumn Harvest Festival, marking the successful completion of the rice cycle, was one of the most important ritual occasions of the Yayoi year. It was a time of communal celebration, of offerings to the powers that had made the harvest possible, of the redistribution of surplus within and between communities, and of the affirmation of the social bonds that made collective agriculture possible in the first place. These harvest festivals are the ancestors of the Matsuri, the festivals that remain central to Japanese community life today. The specific forms have changed enormously across the 2,500 years since the Yayoi period, but the basic structure, the communal gathering, the ritual acknowledgement of the powers that sustain life, the celebration of abundance, and the affirmation of community persists. The Yayoi period saw the emergence in Japan of what we might call a prestige economy, a system in which certain objects carried social meaning far beyond their practical value, and in which the possession and distribution of these objects was central to the operation of political power. The most important prestige objects of the early Yayoi period were bronze, imported from the continent or made in Japan by craftspeople who had learned their skills there. A bronze sword, even one that was never used in combat, was an object of enormous social significance. It represented access to continental networks of trade and knowledge. It represented the wealth to acquire something that most people would never own. And it represented, in the cosmology of the period, a connection to spiritual powers associated with metal, with the transformation of ore into useful and beautiful objects. Bronze mirrors occupied a similarly elevated position in the prestige hierarchy. The mirrors imported from China, with their elaborate decorative backs combining Chinese and emerging Japanese symbolic elements, were not simply objects for looking at one's reflection. They were understood to have spiritual properties, to be capable of reflecting not just physical light, but something more essential, the truth of things, the light of the divine. The chiefs who received bronze mirrors from Chinese diplomats or acquired them through trade were not simply getting valuable objects. They were getting objects whose spiritual potency reinforced and legitimized their political authority. The mirror said, in the symbolic language of the period, that its owner had connections to sources of power and knowledge that ordinary people did not have. And in a world where political authority was inseparable from spiritual authority, that message was of enormous practical importance. The circulation of these prestige objects through networks of gift exchange and trade was itself a form of political activity. A chief who gave a bronze mirror to a neighboring chief was creating an obligation, establishing a relationship of alliance and mutual support, and demonstrating the generosity that was one of the expected qualities of legitimate leadership. Generosity with prestige goods was not simply an expression of personal virtue. It was a political technology, a way of building and maintaining the networks of alliance that made larger political formations possible. Over the course of the Yayoi period, this prestige economy became increasingly sophisticated and increasingly important to the operation of political power. By the end of the period, the chiefs who controlled the largest networks of prestige object circulation were also the most powerful political figures in their regions. And the most powerful of all were those who had direct access to the ultimate source of prestige, the Chinese court itself. Which brings us back, inevitably, to Himiko, and to the question of what it meant, in the Yayoi world, to be recognized by China. The gold seal that the Wei Emperor sent to Himiko in 239 was not simply a diplomatic courtesy. It was an object of immense prestige, an artifact that placed Himiko in a direct relationship with the most powerful ruler in the known world. No other chief in the Japanese islands had such an object. No other chief could claim such a connection. In the prestige economy of the Yayoi world, that connection was worth more than an army. It made Himiko's authority visible, tangible, and, in the symbolic logic of the period, essentially unassailable. She understood that. She had worked for it, sent her envoys across the sea at considerable cost and risk to secure exactly that recognition, and she got it. The gold seal is lost. We do not know what happened to it after Himiko's death. Perhaps it was buried with her in the great tomb that the Weijia records. Perhaps it was passed to her successor. Perhaps it still lies somewhere in the earth of Japan, waiting to be found. But the fact of it, the reality that it existed, that a woman ruling a kingdom on the islands of Japan in the 3rd century was recognized by the Chinese emperor as a legitimate ruler, worthy of an official seal. That fact has not been lost. It is preserved in the Weizhi, copied and recopied across 17 centuries, and it tells us something important about the world that the Yayoi had created. It was a world connected to the larger world, a world that had developed in the space of 6 centuries from small farming villages on the shores of northern Kyushu to a complex of competing kingdoms sophisticated enough to engage in international diplomacy with one of the great empires of the ancient world. That is a remarkable transformation, and it happened here, on these islands, in the centuries before anyone thought to call this place Japan. As the Yayoi period progressed and rice agriculture spread through the Japanese islands, the social world changed in ways that were profound and, in some respects, irreversible. The most fundamental change was the emergence of systematic inequality. This needs some explanation because the Jomon world was not entirely egalitarian. Hunter-gatherer societies typically have social hierarchies of various kinds, based on age, on skill, on the accumulated prestige of long experience. But these hierarchies tend to be relatively flat, relatively permeable, and relatively limited in the degree to which they translate into material difference. The most respected elder in a Jomon village did not live dramatically better than anyone else. They might get the choicest cuts of the deer, the most comfortable spot by the fire, the deference of the community in important decisions. But the basics of life, the food, the shelter, the security, were shared more or less equally. Rice agriculture changed this because rice produces surplus, and surplus can be accumulated, and accumulated surplus is the foundation of wealth. And wealth in a community that depends on the regular production of rice translates into power in ways that the occasional abundance of a particularly good nut harvest never could. The people who controlled the water had power over the people who depended on the water. The people who controlled the storehouses had power over the people who needed access to the stored rice. The people who could organize and direct large-scale collective labor, the construction of irrigation systems, the coordination of planting and harvesting, had power over the people whose labor they organized. And that power, once established, tended to be self-reinforcing. Those who had more could attract more followers, more workers, more military capacity. More followers meant more agricultural production, which meant more surplus, which meant more power to attract still more followers. The circle completed itself, generation after generation, and the result, over the centuries of the Yayoi period, was the emergence of a recognizable aristocracy, families that were consistently wealthier, more powerful, and better connected than their neighbors. Families whose status was inherited rather than earned, fresh in each generation. Families, eventually, that would become the great clans of the Kofun period, and ultimately the Imperial House of Japan. The archaeological evidence for this growing inequality is clear and consistent. In the earlier part of the Yayoi period, the burial evidence shows relatively little differentiation between individuals. The dead were buried with similar quantities of grave goods in similar kinds of graves, without the dramatic distinctions that mark aristocratic burial practices in later periods. But as the period progresses, the differentiation increases. Some graves become much more elaborate than others. The individuals buried in them have access to prestige goods, bronze mirrors, weapons, special items imported from the continent that are simply absent from the ordinary graves around them. The spatial organization of cemeteries begins to show clustering, with groups of richer graves in some areas and groups of poorer graves in others. By the late Yayoi period, some individuals were being buried in a style that can only be described as aristocratic, elevated above their neighbors in death as they were in life, marked out with objects that announce their status to anyone who saw them. The emergence of this kind of hereditary inequality is one of the most significant developments of the Yayoi period, and it set the stage for everything that followed. The great chiefs of the Kofun period, the kings and eventually the emperors of the Japanese state, had their roots in the social dynamics of Yayoi rice agriculture. It all starts with the water. As the social world of the Yayoi became more hierarchical and more complex, it also became more conflicted. The archaeological record of the Yayoi period includes clear evidence of organized, sustained warfare of a kind that was essentially absent from the Jomon record. This is not a coincidence. It is a direct consequence of the social transformations that rice agriculture produced. When people are sedentary, when they have invested enormous labor in specific pieces of land and built storehouses full of surplus and developed the complex water management systems that their fields depend on, they have things worth taking. And when there are things worth taking, there are people who will try to take them. The Yayoi period saw the emergence in Japan of something that the Jomon world had not needed in the same way: defensive architecture. The sites of the late Yayoi period, particularly in the regions of most intense Yayoi settlement in northern Kyushu and the Kenai Plain, were often surrounded by ditches and palisades. Multiple rings of ditches in some cases, the inner ones deeper and more formidable than the outer ones. Watchtowers at the corners of the palisade lines. Gate complexes that controlled and monitored who came and went. These were not casual precautions built against occasional raids by annoying neighbors. They were substantial investments in permanent defensive infrastructure, of the kind that gets built only when the threat is real and ongoing. The human bones from this period confirm it. Skeletal remains with embedded arrowheads, evidence of wounds from bladed weapons, individuals who died from violence and were buried in mass graves or without the care that normal burial practices required, suggesting they died in circumstances of crisis rather than in the ordinary course of life. Japan in the late Yayoi period was not a peaceful place. It was a landscape of competing chiefdoms, each one trying to maintain and expand its territory, its water access, its storage capacity, its military capability. The competition was sometimes resolved by negotiation and alliance, sometimes by marriage between the families of rival chiefs, sometimes by trade, and sometimes by force. It was in this context of competition between increasingly powerful chieftains in a landscape that was experiencing both the benefits and the stresses of agricultural intensification that the figure of Himiko emerged. The sources for Himiko are almost entirely external to Japan. The most important is a section of the Weiji, the Chronicle of the Kingdom of Wei, one of the three kingdoms that divided China after the collapse of the Han Dynasty in the early 3rd century of the Common Era. The wager includes accounts of diplomatic contacts between Wei and various peoples on its frontiers, and among these is a substantial account of a people called the Wa, living on islands to the east, and their ruler, a woman named Himiko. The account in the wager was written by Chinese scholars who had never been to Japan. It was based on the reports of diplomats and merchants who had made the crossing, and on the communications that passed between the Wei courts and the Wei court during the period of diplomatic contact. It is a valuable source, but it needs to be read critically. Chinese chroniclers had conventions for describing peripheral peoples, conventions that shaped what they noticed and how they described what they noticed, and these conventions were not always a reliable guide to the actual character of the societies being described. With those caveats in place, what does the wager tell us about Himiko? She was a woman, which was unusual but not unparalleled in the role of paramount ruler in this region and period. She had never married. She lived in a heavily guarded residence surrounded by towers and walls. She was served by a large household of female attendants. The chronicle says 1,000, though this number should probably be understood as an indication of greatness rather than a precise census. She practiced what the chronicle calls Kido, a term that seems to refer to some form of religious or spiritual practice involving communication with the unseen world. This practice was the source of her authority as much as, perhaps more than, any military or political capacity, and she communicated with the outside world through one person only, her younger brother, who served as her sole intermediary with the political world beyond her inner chambers. He received visitors. He transmitted her commands. He was the face and the voice that Himiko herself chose not to be. The question of how to interpret this arrangement has occupied scholars for a long time. One interpretation emphasizes the religious dimension. In the spiritual traditions of the region, the ability to communicate with the unseen world, the capacity for what we might call mediumship or shamanism, often required a specific kind of purity or separation from the ordinary world. The shaman who was most effective was the one who was most carefully maintained in a state of ritual purity, protected from the contaminating influences of everyday life. Himiko's seclusion may have been understood as a necessary condition of her spiritual effectiveness rather than as a political strategy. Another interpretation emphasizes the political dimension. A ruler who is never seen, who communicates only through a single trusted intermediary, is a ruler whose authority is protected by mystery. You cannot challenge what you cannot see. You cannot undermine what you cannot touch. The inaccessibility of the ruler is itself a form of power, and the arrangement with the brother as intermediary gave Himiko a degree of control over the information that reached her and the information that left her that a more publicly accessible ruler would not have had. The truth is probably that both of these dimensions were present simultaneously, and that neither can be fully separated from the other. Himiko's spiritual authority and her political authority were not distinct categories. In the world she inhabited, spiritual authority was political authority. The ruler who could communicate with the forces that control the harvest and the health of the community was the ruler who had the most legitimate claim to command the cooperation of the people. In the year 239, Himiko sent an embassy to the court of Wei. This was a significant undertaking. The journey from the Hua Islands to the Wei capital required crossing the Korea Strait, traveling through the Korean peninsula, and reaching the heartland of China. It was long, difficult, and potentially dangerous. The fact that Himiko undertook it tells us something important about her understanding of her own situation and her strategic ambitions. The Wei Emperor received the embassy. He sent a formal response, a document that conferred on Himiko a Chinese title and designated her as a friendly ruler in a tributary relationship with the Wei state. Along with the document came gifts, fine silks, bronze mirrors, and a gold seal of office. The bronze mirrors were particularly significant. Bronze mirrors of the type that China exported to its neighbors in this period were understood to carry something of the authority and the spiritual power of the Chinese court. They became, in the hands of the Hua chiefs who received them, objects of great prestige and spiritual potency. They were eventually buried in the great tombs of the Kofun period, accompanying their owners into the afterlife. And the connection between bronze mirrors and royal authority that was established in this period echoes all the way down to the present day in the form of one of the three sacred treasures of the Japanese imperial house. The diplomatic exchange between Himiko and the Wei court was not simply a gesture of submission. It was a sophisticated political maneuver. By securing Chinese recognition, Himiko was enhancing her authority within the Hua world. The question of who among the competing Hua chieftains had the most legitimate claim to overall authority was partly a question of who had the most impressive external connections. And there was no more impressive external connection available than recognition by the Son of Heaven in China. She understood how the game worked, and she played it skillfully. Himiko died sometime around the middle of the 3rd century. The Weizhi records her death briefly, noting that a great burial mound was constructed for her and that more than 100 of her attendants were buried with her. The practice of burying servants and retainers with the deceased ruler, sometimes called sacrifice burial or attendant burial, was practiced in various parts of the world in this period. It reflected a belief that the ruler's needs continued after death, that the relationships and the hierarchy of the living world extended into whatever world came after. Whether the individuals buried with Himiko went willingly as an act of devotion and loyalty or were compelled, we cannot know. The practice feels brutal to modern sensibilities. In the context of its own time and place, it was understood as an honor. After Himiko's death, a man was placed on the throne. The Weizhi records that the people refused to accept him, that there was disorder and conflict, and that eventually a young girl, a relative of Himiko named Iyo or Toyo, was installed as ruler instead. Peace was restored. This sequence of events is remarkable. An adult man with a legitimate claim to power was rejected by the population. A girl of 13 was accepted. The crucial variable seems to have been the connection to Himiko's lineage and, perhaps, to Himiko's particular kind of spiritual authority. It suggests that Himiko's power was not simply the power of the strongest, or the most militarily capable, or even the most politically astute. It was the power of someone who was understood to have a unique relationship with the forces that governed the world. And that kind of power, in the understanding of the people who lived under it, was not transferable to just anyone. It ran in specific channels, through specific lineages, and it required specific qualities that could not be simply assumed by force. In a world we often think of as governed entirely by the hard realities of military strength and material wealth, the story of Himiko's succession reminds us that belief and spiritual authority were political forces of the first order. They shaped what people would accept and what they would resist, what they would fight for and what they would submit to. Himiko understood that. She built her authority on it. And for decades, it worked. The mystery of where Himiko's kingdom actually was has never been resolved, and it probably never will be. But the debate itself is revealing, because it tells us something important about how Japanese people across the centuries have understood their own origins. The two main theories, the Kyushu theory and the Kinai theory, are not simply competing archaeological hypotheses. They carry different implications for the continuity between Himiko's world and the Japan that came after. If Yamatai was in Kyushu, then Himiko's kingdom was a regional power that eventually lost out to the Yamato kingdom centered in the Kinai plain, and the connection between Himiko and the later imperial tradition is indirect at best. The Yamato state that became the foundation of Japanese civilization would have emerged separately, in a different place, from different roots. If Yamatai was in the Kinai, then Himiko's kingdom was the direct ancestor of the Yamato state. The line from Himiko to the imperial family that has continued to the present day would be unbroken. The first ruler of Japan we can actually name would be a female shaman whose power derived from her ability to communicate with the spirit world, and the imperial tradition that has lasted for more than a millennium would have its roots in that specific kind of authority. Japanese scholars have debated this question with an intensity that sometimes surprises Western observers. The stakes feel high in a way that is not immediately obvious from outside, but they make sense when you understand that the question of where Yamatai was is also, in a deep sense, the question of what Japan is and where it comes from. Is Japan a civilization whose origins lie in the Kinai Plain, in the rice fields of the Yamato Basin, in the direct line from Himiko to the present emperor? Or is it a civilization whose origins are more dispersed, more contested, the product of a more complex process of competition and synthesis among different regional powers? The archaeology cannot answer this question definitively. The historical sources are too ambiguous. And so the debate continues, generation after generation, a mirror in which each era sees its own concerns and assumptions reflected back at it. Himiko herself, if she could observe this debate, might find it somewhat beside the point. She was not trying to found a civilization. She was trying to rule her kingdom effectively, to maintain the alliances that kept it together, to manage the spiritual authority on which her legitimacy depended, to survive in a world of competing powers that would have eliminated her if she had shown weakness. She succeeded at all of this for a considerable period of time. And then she died, as everyone does, and her death created a crisis that her successors resolved by finding another woman to fill her role. That is the shape of her story as we have it. A life of considerable accomplishment, a death, a crisis, a resolution. The universal shape of human stories, played out in a specific place and time and circumstances that made it unlike any other. The transition from the Yayoi period to the Kofun period was not a sharp break. There was no moment at which one era ended and another began, no event that contemporaries would have recognized as a transformation of historical significance. What happened was gradual. Over the course of the 3rd and 4th centuries, the political landscape of Japan shifted. The competing chiefdoms of the late Yayoi period were slowly consolidated through conquest and alliance and the slow accumulation of advantage into larger and fewer political units. The Yamato kingdom, centered in the Kinai Plain, emerged as the dominant power in western Japan. Other regional powers persisted, sometimes as subordinate allies, sometimes as continuing rivals, but the center of gravity had shifted. And with this political consolidation came a new expression of power and prestige. The keyhole-shaped burial mound, the Kofun, which gave the period its name. The first large kofun appear in the Kinai region in the late 3rd or early 4th century. Their construction represents a significant investment of labor and resources, a demonstration of the organizational capacity of the Yamato kingdom at a stage when that capacity was still being established and proven. The logic of the kofun was not entirely new. Elaborate burial of important individuals with goods that reflected their status and their claimed connections to sacred power had been practiced throughout the Yayoi period. What changed was the scale. The kofun were not simply larger versions of Yayoi elite burials. They were something qualitatively different, monuments that required sustained collective effort on a scale that only a genuinely powerful political center could organize and sustain. Building a large kofun was, among other things, a demonstration of power. Not just the power to command labor, though that was part of it, but the power to maintain a project across time, to keep thousands of workers organized and supplied and directed toward a single goal for years or decades. That kind of sustained organizational capacity was itself a form of political statement, visible in the landscape, impossible to ignore or misinterpret. The kofun said, to everyone who could see them, there is a power here that can do this. A power that can move this much earth, place this many stones, maintain this much effort across this many years. A power that you should think carefully about before you decide to challenge it. The contents of the early kofun burial chambers tell us a great deal about the ideology of the rulers who were buried in them and the society that built their monuments. The bronze mirrors are perhaps the most significant single category of burial good. In the earliest large kofun, dozens of mirrors might be placed around the body of the deceased, their reflecting surfaces turned inward toward the dead, rather than outward toward the world of the living. This inward orientation is significant. The mirrors were not there to reflect the world around them. They were there to do something else, something that we can only partially reconstruct from the evidence. Perhaps they were understood to reflect the sacred essence of the buried ruler back toward their body, maintaining some connection between the ruler's spiritual power and the physical remains after death. Perhaps they were offerings to the ruler for use in whatever existence followed this one. Perhaps they were understood as protective, surrounding the dead with the divine light associated with Amaterasu, from whom the ruler claimed descent. All of these interpretations have been proposed, and none of them can be definitively confirmed or refuted. The mirrors sit in their darkness, their surfaces still capable of reflecting after more than 1,500 years in the earth, and they do not explain themselves. What they do tell us, clearly and unambiguously, is that the rulers buried in the early Kofun were understood to have a specific relationship with the divine, a relationship that was expressed through these objects of sacred significance, and that was important enough to be maintained and affirmed even in death. The iron swords in the burial chambers carry a different kind of symbolism. Where the mirrors speak of divine connection and spiritual authority, the swords speak of earthly power, of the capacity for organized violence that is the foundation of political authority in most periods of human history. A ruler buried with swords is a ruler whose claim to authority rested in part on military capacity, on the ability to protect those who accepted their leadership and to threaten those who did not. The Jade Magatama occupy a middle ground between these two poles, spiritual and martial. Their curved, kama-like shape is ancient in Japan, going back to the Jomon period, and whatever meaning the shape carried in those earliest contexts had accumulated layers of new meaning across the millennia. By the Kofun period, Magatama were objects of unmistakably sacred significance, connected to the divine ancestry of the ruling family and to the cosmic forces that sustained the natural order. Mirror, sword, Magatama, these three objects, placed together in the burial chambers of the early Kofun rulers, became the foundation of a symbolic system that would persist in continuously elaborated and reinterpreted forms through all the subsequent centuries of Japanese history. They are still the sacred treasures of the Japanese imperial house, still present in their original forms or in later replacements at the ceremonies of imperial succession, still understood as the material embodiment of the legitimacy of the oldest continuing monarchy in the world. The thread from the Kofun to the present is thin in places, and it has been reinterpreted and reimagined many times across the centuries. But it has not broken. The objects in the darkness of the burial chambers and the objects at the heart of the imperial tradition are connected by a line of symbolic continuity that reaches back nearly 2,000 years. That continuity is one of the most remarkable things about Japanese civilization, not the samurai, not the temples, not the aesthetic traditions, as remarkable as all of these are, but this, the unbroken thread from the burial chambers of the early Kofun to the living institutions of the present day, the persistence of meaning across 2 millennia of change. It starts in the darkness of the burial chambers, with the mirrors facing inward, with the swords wrapped in rotting silk, with the jade Magatama curved like a question mark beside the bones of someone whose name we may never know. It starts there, and it has not ended yet.